This was never revenge. It was trauma choosing a new language. She believed she was punishing a cheating fiancé by seducing his older brother, a highly controlled mafia leader with textbook dominance patterns. But what she stepped into was far darker: emotional imprinting, obsession, displacement, and a family system built on manipulation. The younger brother wanted possession. The older brother wanted control. And she mistook calculated danger for safety. What makes this story terrifying is not the affair, it's how every character mistakes their wound for love.
The infidelity was a single ember dropped into dry kindling, set to ignite a blaze beyond Ator's imagining. His betrayal was not singular but doubled, an offense committed with 2 other women. Yet she did not rage, or weep, or shatter a single thing. Lena's reaction was a scalpel's cut, aimed at his brother, Rela Montalvo, the family's dreaded head. Rela was a walking death sentence, avoided by all save the hopeless or those with nothing left to lose, and she was now both. Her plan was brutally direct. One night in his bed, a single devastating blow to Ator's greatest weakness. But Rela's touch was not that of a tool being used, it was the grasp of a victor seizing his spoils. His words afterward unveiled a terrible reality. This was never about punishing just one brother. She had fallen into the orbit of Palermo's deadliest man. The real terror, though, was the deep-seated yearning to do it again. This is Lena's story, and this is where it starts. Chapter 1. The Unveiling. It all began with a sign. The apartment door left open, a stark deviation from the norm that screamed of danger. Etteore's obsession with security was a constant. This unsecured latch felt like an open invitation from fate itself to see his betrayal. She stepped inside. The sound came first, then the light, a faint luminescence from the bedroom before the scene unfurled like a silent, gut-wrenching photograph. He was with 2 other women, lost to the world, unaware of her standing in the frame of the door, the keys to their future dangling from her fingers. The same keys he had given her as a promise of his exclusive love. For 3 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. A strange woman's laugh echoed. A foreign perfume tainted the sheets she had picked out. And in the middle of it all was Ettore, the beautiful face that had pulled her away from her life in Naples and into this strange new place. There was no scream from her lips. She would not give him the satisfaction of calling her mad or overwrought. She simply backed away, closed the door with quiet skill, and slipped out of the flat like she was never there. Her orphaned childhood taught her one thing above all. The most powerful sorrow is the kind you hold back, sharpen into a weapon, and unleash with deadly aim. She walked down to her car, nestled on a tight Palermo street under the solitary glow of an amber light, and slid into the driver's seat. Her fingers clenched the wheel, but the ignition stayed off. She gazed into nothingness while the familiar tightness gripped her lungs and a fire started behind her eyes. The tears, once started, would be a flood. She couldn't stop. She choked them down, turned the key, and pulled away. At night, Palermo had a beauty that seemed almost staged, too perfect to be real. Old buildings and lit-up cathedrals stood stark against the night sky, while the ocean breeze mixed with the city's warmth. In the last 2 years, she had started to call this place home, a change she made entirely for Ettore. Tonight, though, every road felt like the ghost of a life that had been cut away. Bringing her to Palermo was his crowning achievement. Ettore Montecalvo, the ideal fiancé, charming, handsome, and heir to a powerful Sicilian family. And then there was her, Ortensia Ferrante, a craftswoman from Naples, brought up with little, looking after her sister with no interest in the Mafia, grand mansions, or men whose last names carried more power than any judge. Her parents were killed in a car crash when she was only 19 years old. Overnight, she became the protector of Fametta, who was 12, and still saw the world as a fair place. Lena held no such beliefs, but she protected that innocence in her sister. She worked 3 different jobs, with her talent for making jewelry being the one thing that paid the bills. And then came Ettore, whose persistence and charm were reinforced by a smile that offered a haven. She decided to believe in him. She left Naples, putting Fametta into the hesitant care of an aunt to build a future in Palermo with the man who was now in their bed with other women. She stopped the car at a scenic overlook, a place usually full of tourists taking pictures of the harbor by day. At this late hour, the lookout point was deserted, and the city lights spread out beneath her were just an empty pattern in the dark. She took out her phone and called the one person who would always answer. Fametta's tired voice came through on the 4th ring. "Ort, it's 2 in the morning. Who's dead?" "Ettore cheated," Lena said, her tone as flat and objective as a news bulletin. 5 seconds of pure silence passed. "Wait," Fametta said, and Lena could hear the rustle of sheets as she sat up. "Who was it?" "2 women." Another pause, shorter this time. "He was sleeping with 2 of them." Her sister's voice cracked, not with anger, but with a brand of disbelief that Fametta always managed to turn into dark comedy. "The man can't even have an affair, right? 1 makes you a stereotype. 2 makes you a loser." The corner of Lena's mouth lifted slightly. That was pure Fametta. She could throw out a line like that in the middle of a disaster and make it seem smaller for a second. The strength wasn't in the joke itself, but in the unbreakable bond it signified. She had someone in her corner. "You have to get out of there. Come back to Naples. Take the first train home." "I'm staying," Lena said, her eyes fixed on the lights of the harbor far below. "But why?" Lena didn't answer, not because she had no reason, but because her plan was forming and needed quiet to take shape. Fametta knew without being told. Her farewell was heavy with things left unsaid as she hung up. Lena sat there, the phone on her thigh, as the Palermo breeze swept into the car, bringing with it the smell of the ocean and a feeling she didn't recognize. It wasn't sadness or rage. It was a colder, more calculated instinct, a piece of her real self she had kept hidden for years. That evening, Ettore Montecalvo broke her life into pieces, and she decided he would pay in a way he could never imagine. Chapter 2. The Brother. She said nothing for 2 days. When Ettore called the next day, he acted as if everything was perfectly fine. He mentioned lunch, griped about a meeting with their money manager, and finished with a mechanical, "I love you." The word sounded like just another item on his daily agenda. She assured him she was fine and set it back. Hanging up, her stomach was a tight ball of ice, but her hands didn't shake. This wasn't an act, it was strategy. The retribution growing inside her was not some wild, destructive beast. This was a kind of revenge that demanded silence, accuracy, and a target that would cause more pain than mere words ever could. She had already chosen who it would be. How she would get to him was the only question. On the second evening, a perfect chance fell into her lap. The regular family dinner at the Villa Montecalvo. Once a month, the matriarch gathered her sons, the organization's key figures, and anyone else who needed a reminder of their place. Since she was Ettore's fiancé, she had to be there. She picked a black dress with a high neck, pinned her hair up, and painted her lips with a dark stain. The woman looking back at her from the glass brought a sudden clarity. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't dressed to be looked at. She was dressed for war. The Via Montecalvo sat on a hill on the outskirts of Palermo, with a view of the city and the water. It was an ancient property, walled in by huge stone barriers, hidden gardens, and a creaking iron gate that marked the entrance to another world. The car crunched over the gravel path and stopped as two guards opened their doors without a word. As she got out, he put a hand on her waist with the casual possessiveness of someone who believed a ring on her finger meant he owned her. The dining room was immense, ruled by a long, dark table that could fit 15 people, all under the shadow of a massive iron chandelier. When they arrived, nearly every seat was taken. Servants glided through the room, topping off glasses etched with the family seal. At the head of the table sat Donna Lucaya Montecalvo, the 58-year-old head of the family. Her gray hair was wound in a tight bun, gold necklaces draped her throat, and she projected an air of total command. As the mother of Ettore and Rella, she ruled the home with a force her sons dared not question. She greeted Lena with a nod and no smile, the kindest she had ever been. To Donna Lucaya, Lena would always be the nobody from Naples, an unwelcome guest at her holy table. The players are now in position. Hortensia sits next to Ettore, who is lost in conversation with a captain about shipping details. Across from them sits Saro Ferrante, the family's advisor, no relation despite the name, his tired eyes scanning the scene. Saro is 60 and bald and treats everyone with a polite distance. Leaning against a wall nearby is Bastiano, Rea's top man, an intimidating figure. In his early 30s and built like a bull, his quietness is hard to read, a mix of boredom and a predator's watchfulness. Bastiano has followed Riela like a shadow since they were boys, their connection deeper than any sworn oath. Just as dessert is about to be served, a breach in decorum occurs. Ettore answers his phone at the table. A quiet, furious condemnation flashes across Donna Lucaya's face as her lips tighten into a thin, white slash. But he is completely unaware. The conversation is brief, less than a minute, but 2 words hang in the air, signaling trouble, transfer, and postponed. When he hangs up, Saro looks at him over the top of his glasses, his voice as impartial as a forecast. A problem with the dock accounts, Ettore. Ettore flashes a smooth smile, his default reaction to dismiss any worry. It's nothing a good bookkeeper can't fix, Saro replies. The man lifted his glass, a study in tranquility, but for a heartbeat, his knuckles turned to bone against the stem. Bastiano, feigning apathy, let his arms fall, his eyes flicking to Rella with a message I wouldn't grasp until much later, the loaded silence of a man holding the pin on a grenade. Then my eyes settled on him, Rella Montecalvo, enthroned at the table's head. I'd seen him before, a fleeting presence at other dinners, yet I had never truly seen the man himself. I had missed the crushing weight he bore, a spine of solid steel and hands that rested on the table as if commanding the earth to stay its course. For 6 years following the death of his father, Don Salvatore, Rella had reigned over the Montecalvo clan. He had claimed his authority at 26, a leader of few words and no mercy for mistakes. He was not blessed with Ettore's photogenic appeal, the sculpted jaw, the light eyes, the easy smile. Rella's countenance, instead, compelled silence in rooms full of killers. His was a face etched with severe lines, a jaw set in stone, and dark eyes that consumed the world around him. Yet this night was a departure from the norm. This night his gaze settled on me, unwavering. It was during dessert, while Donna Lucrezia spoke of renovations and her capos quietly protested the price. As Itere laughed at some jest, I drew lazy circles in my untouched wine, suddenly sensing the weight of an unwavering gaze. My head came up, my eyes meeting Rella's. His focus was so absolute it felt like a hand at my throat, stealing the air from my lungs. He held the look for 2, possibly 3 seconds beyond propriety before glancing away, pretending the moment never happened. But it had, and a cold truth dawned on me. This was not a first glance. Rella Montecalvo had watched me this way before, during other meals, in other hallways, in all the times I was too busy performing as Ittore's fiancé to see his brother's eyes on me from the edges. Over the meal, Donna Lucrezia's voice cut through the air, feigning warmth but sharp with condescension. "Hortensia, my love, how fares that quaint jewelry hobby of yours?" Ittore chimed in. "You are making such lovely pieces. It's wonderful to have a little pastime." That word, hobby, hit me like a fist. 2 years of my soul, a Palermo exhibition, 3 commissions from abroad reduced to a trifle. I was ready to answer, but Ittore interjected. "Mother Hortensia's talented, her art sells." He spoke with the flat affect of someone reading a weather report, his words a hollow defense designed only to end the silence. I managed a smile and a quiet thanks, dousing my real response with wine. Once dinner concluded, the men retreated to the study while the women gathered the parlor. I felt no pull toward either group, so I slipped away into the corridor, connecting the dining room and the gardens. It was a cavernous stone passage, hung with glaring gold-framed ancestors. The air held a deep chill, and the quiet felt thick and menacing. That is where I found Rella. He was stepping out of the study entirely by himself. No Bastiano, no Saro, or any of his guard. He noticed me and just stopped. He didn't step aside, didn't move to pass, offered no curt nod. He simply halted, his eyes on me, and waited. The hall could have fit 2 people, yet we both stood claiming the middle. All at once, the space between us felt far too close. "You are not with the others in the sitting room," he noted. His voice was a deeper, more resonant thing than I recalled. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, the kind of opener a man who deals in commands, not conversation, would use. "I am not like the others," I heard myself say, the response slipping out uncensored. For a second, I thought I'd made a fatal error, but Rella's face was a mask. Then, the edge of his mouth lifted, maybe by a millimeter. It was a fleeting motion, easily missed. But in that tiny shift, I saw what I never would have predicted from a man like him. Surprise. He had expected submission and found a challenge. Interesting. That was all he said. He moved past me, but his scent hung in the air for 5 seconds after he was gone. It was earthy and severe, a fragrance not meant to entice, but simply to exist, like the man himself. I remained there, heart racing, as a thought clicked into focus with the finality of a lock. Rella Montecalvo, Ettore's brother, the feared and unopposed Don, had just given me a phantom smile in an empty corridor with no one watching. The car ride home was silent on my part. Itere opened my door, kissed my forehead, and commented on what a pleasant evening it was. I agreed, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror as the Montecalvo estate faded into black. Rella Montecalvo was the perfect weapon for my vengeance. He was the one strike Ettore would never anticipate. The most disturbing thing wasn't the scheme itself, but the chilling speed with which it took root, as if it had been lying dormant inside me, needing only a spark. Chapter 3. Fighting Fire with Fire. Within a week of that dinner, I knew Rella's habits better than he did. Ettore made it easy, constantly complaining about his brother's long hours, his private meetings, and his unilateral command. "He's dining at Ferraro's again," Ettore would mutter, as though the restaurant was somehow insulting. "He spends more time there than at the estate." I hoarded every scrap of intelligence, a jeweler collecting raw stones to be fashioned into a weapon. Ristorante Ferraro was situated on a tight street in Palermo's historic quarter, a lane hostile to traffic but always shadowed by a black car with tinted windows. The place was unassuming from the outside, a simple wood door, a small brass plate, no garish signs or lines. Inside was all dark wood, subdued lighting, and a charged silence that spoke of deals more important than dinner. I came on a Tuesday by myself after telling Ettore I was seeing a gallery contact. He didn't even bother asking for a name. I settled at the bar, ordered a red wine, and watched the door as if I had all the time in the world. Rella walked in at 9:15. I saw him the moment he arrived. The door opened to admit him, Bastiano trailing 2 steps behind like a shadow. As expected, their entrance shifted the room's gravity. The manager's spine stiffened. A server appeared instantly, and a pair of men near the door adjusted their posture. Rella was in a dark suit without a tie, his collar open. He moved with the quiet power of a man who knew he owned every soul in the room. His eyes locked with mine from the doorway. Instead of heading to his table, he whispered to Bastiano. Bastiano's eyes flickered from me to his boss before he proceeded to their table alone. Rella walked to the bar and took the stool next to me. He kept a very precise distance between us, too intentional to be casual, but too wide to be a proposition. "You again," he said, not looking at me. He signaled the bartender, who immediately poured a whiskey. Clearly, they knew him here. "Me again," I replied, moving the wine in my glass. "Alone." "So it seems." He drank, his eyes scanning the bottles on the shelf as if they held some arcane code. Then he turned, and the look he gave me was far too serious for a place like this. It was sharp and insistent, as though he were trying to unearth a truth I had long since buried. "My brother's intended," he stated, "rarely appears in places she has not selected herself." This was not an observation, it was a gauntlet thrown down. "Perhaps her list of places has changed," I shot back, holding his gaze. A tiny muscle jumped at the corner of his mouth, a sign my retort had hit home. He drained his glass in a single movement, set it down, and stood. "Good night, Hortensia." The way he spoke my name gave each syllable a distinct and heavy weight. He moved to his shadowed table where Bastiano waited, arms crossed over his chest, a look on his face I wouldn't decipher until much later. It was the expression of a man who has seen what he shouldn't and has chosen to remain silent. As Rella sat, Bastiano's arms dropped, his eyes flicking to the bar, to me, and then settling on Rella. Without lifting his head from the menu, Rella said, "Sit, Bastiano." For 2 full seconds, Bastiano stayed put, as if considering defiance, before he answered, "I think I'll remain standing. The view is better from here." Rella didn't reply, but even from across the room I saw it. That hint of a curve on his lips again, this time almost a genuine smile. Then, 4 days later, the next chapter unfolds. Only this time, she isn't the one orchestrating the meeting. She is attending a small gallery event in Palermo, watching guests look at 3 of her sculptures. The bell above the door rings, and Rella Montecalvo steps inside, cool and contained, moving as if he owned the entire street. He is alone, no guards, no crew. He wears a dark shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and the air in the space immediately thickens, just as it had the first time. The air thins, charged with the tension she masks with forced calm. "I wasn't expecting you," she says, the words a fragile shield against her racing heart. He stands before her work. "The invitation was at the house," he replies. "E.T. left it. I thought the exhibit might be worth my time." The implication lands like a stone. He came for the art, not for her. A dismissal she reads perfectly. But then his gaze deepens, truly seeing her creations. His focus lands on a silver bracelet with blood-red coral, a piece she holds dear. Then he delivers a verdict that fractures her composure. The coral isn't an accent, it's the architecture. A silent shock ripples through her. Critics, experts, none had seen it. Yet this ruler of the underworld, this capo, was reflecting the very soul of her craft back at her. All she can manage is, "You have an eye for design." "I see things made with purpose," he parries. They lean over the glass, the space between them humming with unspoken energy. His hand moves toward the bracelet, his fingers brushing hers for a suspended 3 seconds. Neither pulls away. The current holds them until he lifts the piece, studies it, then places it back, pointedly ignoring the charge that had just passed between their hands. "Fine work, Hortensia," is all he says, turning and walking away without a second glance. The ghost of his touch leaves her reeling. The map of her revenge has just become a treacherous, unreadable territory. Their third meeting is the breaking point. It comes late one night in the villa's garden after another hollow family meal. She had fled there to breathe, away from Donna Lucrezia's suffocating drama. The garden is a walled secret, thick with the scent of oranges, a stone bench at its heart. And on that bench, wrapped in thought, sits Rel. He registers her presence not with surprise, but with a slight nod, as if he had been awaiting her. "Fleeing the party?" she asks, her steps measured as she closes the distance. "Fleeing my mother," he amends, which in this house amounts to the same thing. A true laugh escapes her, startling them both. She sits beside him, a deliberate and daring breach of distance. A quiet moment settles between them. "Do you like this life?" he asks. "Palermo." The question is deceptively simple, yet it holds the weight of a sentence. "Parts of it," she admits. "But I'm smaller here. In Naples, I was someone. Here, I am just the new woman." He becomes unnervingly still, her words finding a target deep inside him. He offers a piece of his own story. "I took over the family at 26, he says. My father died, and the next day 30 men were waiting for my orders. Nobody asked if I was ready. They were just waiting." With that single confession, she sees the man beneath the monster. Not the capo, but a lone king of a kingdom he never sought. "Do you miss it?" she asks, her voice soft. "Who you were before?" A long silence hangs in the air before he whispers, "I don't remember him." The words strike her with the force of recognition. She understands completely. She cannot remember herself before her parents' deaths, before the weight of raising Fiamma. In this shared void, the game between them evaporates. This is not strategy. This is visceral and real. He turns to her, erasing the last inch of air separating them. She feels his warmth, breathes his scent, hears the quiet rhythm of his control. He leans in, the motion slow, deliberate, a man fully conscious of the line he is about to cross. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, Hortensia," he murmurs, his breath a warm ghost on her cheek. "Perhaps," she breathes back, her eyes locked on his, "but I'm not the one losing control." The gauntlet is thrown. His eyes drop to her mouth, then snap back to hers, a war raging within him. And then Rel stops. He knows that to close this gap with his family 30 meters away would burn his world to the ground. He stands, adjusts his collar, and says a quiet, "Good night," and vanishes. She sits frozen on the bench, her pulse a frantic drum, trying to piece back together the lie that this is her revenge, that she is in command. The next morning, she gives Famata the edited highlights. "So let me get this straight," Famata says. "You've switched targets from the cheating brother to the Mafia kingpin brother." "Hortensia, that is not a plan," she deadpans. "That is an expensive cable series." For the first time in ages, Hortensia laughs, and the alien sound of it frightens her. Later, she tries to sketch a silver ring, but the graphite refuses to obey. She erases again and again until she sees she isn't drawing jewelry at all. She is tracing the hard line of his jaw, a profile she has no business remembering so vividly. The pencil slips from her fingers. She stares at the sketch, her heart a trapped bird, the entire purpose of her mission dissolving before her eyes. The goal was to get close to Rel, for Etred to find out, to cause pain. She wasn't supposed to enjoy the ruse. He wasn't supposed to take root in her mind. She definitely wasn't supposed to hear his voice. I see things made with purpose and feel he was speaking of her soul, not her art. She was never, ever supposed to feel his touch when she looked at the coral. But he is everywhere now. She remembers it all. She feels it all. So when Etre calls that night to discuss a 2-day trip to Catania, a supplier meeting, his voice is exactly what it has always been. Carelessly ignorant, the voice of a man unaware his life is balanced on a knife's edge. She waits for the expected burn of rage, for the sting of betrayal that has been her only fuel. She braces for the impact, but what arrives is a cold vacuum, something worse than hate, utter indifference. Itre Monte Calvo is talking, and she feels nothing at all, no fury, no ache, no thirst for vengeance. He had become static, a television left on in an empty room. And if he was static, so was her revenge. Vengeance needs a fire, and hers had been drowned by something else, something captured in that drawing. It was in the phantom warmth on her skin from the garden, in the memory of a burdened man admitting he had lost himself. She crushed the sketch of Rel's jaw, threw it in the trash, and repeated the lie. "This is still about revenge. I am in control. The plan is unchanged." It was a fiction she was too afraid to abandon. Across the city, Etre was starting to notice that something was wrong. A text that was too short. A look he couldn't read. The way she shielded her phone when he entered a room. He hadn't solved the puzzle yet, but he was watching, and she could feel her time running out. Chapter 4: The Night of the Unraveling. 2 weeks after they first met, she made the call from which there was no return. It was not impulse. For 14 days, a civil war had consumed her, logic against instinct. Her mind told her, Rallo Montecalvo is a tool, not the prize. But her heart told a different story, and that story was stealing her sleep, making her remember his touch in the gallery when she should have been plotting his family's downfall. It had her smelling orange blossoms in the garden while lying in her own bed. She called it adrenaline, the thrill of the game, the high of her own cleverness. She swore that once her vengeance was done, these sensations would fade. But the night she started her car and drove toward the Villa Montecalvo without a word to anyone, she knew the era of self-delusion was over. She reached the estate near 11 p.m. The front gates were sealed, but a lone light burned in an upstairs window, Rel's study, his midnight kingdom. She parked on the street, got out, and walked to the guard at the side gate. He knew her face, the fiancé, and gave her that careful mix of confusion and respect the staff held for anyone branded Monte Calvo. "I need to see Rel," she told him, the use of his first name a deliberate choice, not Mr. Monte Calvo, not the boss. The guard clocked the shift immediately but was smart enough to say nothing. He murmured into his radio, got an answer, and pulled the gate open without another word. The villa felt different in the dark. The hallways, usually humming with life, were now shadowed and silent, broken by islands of light on the marble. With every footstep's echo, she knew she was walking toward an irreversible fate. At the second floor's far end was Rel's study, behind a heavy door she had never breached. Reaching it, she saw it was ajar, a blade of light cutting across the hall. She nudged it open and went in. He was at his desk in a dark rolled-sleeve shirt, flanked by stacks of paper. The room was the man himself. Shadowed wood walls, shelves crammed with books, a worn leather chair, and the rich scent of timber and coffee. The open window let in a night breeze tasting of the sea and nearby orange blossoms. The moment I entered, Rel's gaze snared mine, turning the silence into a weapon. He assessed me with that familiar, analytical precision of a man planning a strategic move. I stood frozen in a plain dark dress, my hair loose, the frantic rhythm in my chest a signal I was sure he could read. "Hortensia," he said, and hearing my name at 11 at night in his private study as the door latched shut, felt like a territorial claim. "I had to see you," I risked, taking a single step. The desk was a barricade between us, but it felt meaningless. "This late," he stated, a fact, not a question. He rounded the desk with a slow, predatory grace, not walking so much as repositioning himself for the kill. Each step he took seemed to steal the air from the room, the temperature climbing as he closed the distance. He stopped less than a foot from me, forcing my head back to meet his stare. In this space, without the garden, the guests, or the pretense of chance, his presence had a different weight. It was more focused, infinitely more dangerous. "You did not come for me," he said, his voice a low current with a treacherous undertow I'd never heard. "You are here because of him." The statement hit me with the force of cold, hard truth. Not for being wrong, but for being precisely right, the very foundation of my mission. I had come to find a weapon. I was here to make Rel the very instrument of Etra's destruction. And he saw it all. His perception had been a silent witness to my entire plot. My lips parted to form a denial. Anything to salvage the pretense of control, but he gave me no opening. "It makes no difference to me," he said, and his mouth was on mine. The kiss landed before his words could. This wasn't a question. It was a precise, calculated act, its pressure firm and knowing, as if practiced 1,000 times in his mind. His hands held my face with a grip that wasn't painful, just unbreakable. I could feel his warmth, taste his whiskey, and smell the wood smoke that clung to him. But this close, it was something more primal. It was a heat, a weight. That was his alone. This was my chance to escape. I should have shoved him back, fixed my dress, and made a sharp comment on his presumption. But his kiss short-circuited my thoughts. My body responded long before my mind could protest. My hands, on their own, grasped his shirt, feeling the rough fabric and the solid muscle beneath, while his fingers drew a line from my face to my throat, lingering in the hollow there with a purpose that left me breathless. What happened next was never part of my plan. Nothing that night was. I knew Rel was a man who moved through the world like a blade, He led men with a word and faced enemies with a stare colder than any bullet. But here, alone in the sleeping villa, he was a different force of nature. Every touch was deliberate, as if he had waited for this exact moment and would not waste it. His hands moved over me with a reverence I'd never known from handsome, charming men, for whom contact was just another negotiation. Rella was unhurried. He held my eyes with each new touch, asking for consent without speaking, giving me every chance to flee while radiating the knowledge that I wouldn't. His fingers eased the strap of my dress down my shoulder with an almost painful slowness. As the silk slid across my skin, I saw his jaw clench, a flicker of the immense control it was costing him. At some point, my back pressed against the cool wood of his desk, a stark contrast to the heat rolling off his skin. A gasp tore from my throat, and he paused. Not at my urging, but to analyze the sound, to know it. His dark, intense eyes locked on mine. And in them, I saw something more terrifying than any touch. This wasn't seduction. This was a primal, absolute need. I ripped at his shirt. The buttons gave. The material fell open. The second my hands touched his skin, hot, tight, and mapped with the pale lines of old scars, his breathing hitched. It became a broken, desperate sound. It was the first crack in the legendary composure of Rella Montecalvo. He lifted me by the waist, setting me on the desk's edge with a startling ease that stole my breath. He settled between my legs, his hands gripping my hips, and pressed his forehead to mine. For an endless moment, we stayed like that, sharing the charged air, balanced on the edge of the unchangeable. As our last clothes were cast aside, his expression was not of lust, but of pure will, the look of a man in complete command who needed me to know it. He entered me with a slow, certain push. The feeling made me arch back, my nails digging into his shoulders. He held still, his breath catching, his eyes boring into mine. In that moment, she saw it, a fissure in his composure. This was an exchange of surrender as much as of dominance. The cadence he set was a study in absolute control, a slow, profound rhythm, withdrawing to the very edge of separation before claiming her again. He gauged her every tremor, his hands anchoring her hips to him. The desk groaned beneath them, a raw percussion against the sound of their strained breaths, and her name, a mere whisper against the pulse in her throat. The tension coiled until it snapped. He drove faster, deeper, and her reality contracted to the singular point of his presence. She shattered first, a tremor racking her frame as she could only hold on. Rella followed an instant later, his own body locking in a final, potent surge. A guttural sound tore from him against her skin, an admission he did not try to stifle. For the first time, the man's flawless self-possession had utterly fractured. After, a silence fell upon the study, heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. An untold time passed. He remained braced against the desk, his shirt undone, hair in disarray. She stood near the window, her hands shaking as she righted her dress, the air thick with the scent of the sea, the night, and something far more primal. It was Rella who broke the stillness. "This was never part of your plan," he stated, his gaze fixed on some distant point. His voice was rougher, with a new quality she couldn't name. It was not cold or controlled. It was just brutally honest. And no, it hadn't been part of her plan either. She didn't answer. What was there to say? He was absolutely right. She had come to this house to set brother against brother. What just happened in his study had torched that script. The fire, the intensity, the way he felt like a missing piece of her soul, that wasn't about revenge. It was a terror far greater than the betrayal that had led her here. She fled the villa before dawn. The massive iron gate cried open, the sound echoing over the hills like a final, useless warning. She fell into her car, her hands gripping the wheel as she stared into the dark, trying to comprehend the night's wreckage. She took out her phone, texting Fia. "I have to talk to you." A reply flashed back in under 30 seconds, though it was nearly 3 in the morning. "If you're confessing to murder, I'm on the first train to Palermo. If not, it can wait. I have an 8 o'clock exam." A small smile touched her lips. She dropped the phone, started the engine, and drove down the hill. Palermo was spread below, a glowing map of everything she had just broken. What she could never have known was that someone else in the villa was wide awake, and that in 3 days, the House of Monte Calvo was about to learn everything. Chapter 5. Blood and Silence. 72 hours. That was the time it took for her entire life to implode. For 3 days, she lived on a precipice. She woke with Etre, drank coffee with him, and answered his messages as though nothing was wrong, while the gravity of her betrayal was a constant, physical ache. Her body held a memory her voice could not confess. Her fingers could still trace the weave of Rella's shirt. Her skin remembered his warmth, his presence, and the scent of salt and timber that lingered long after she fled the villa. She sent no word to Rella. He sent none to her. The resulting void, which should have been a comfort, instead became a suffocating dread she could not escape. On the 3rd day, a family lunch was convened by Donna Lucrezia at the villa. It was a casual gathering, with the table arranged on the garden terrace, its white linen stark beneath the fierce Palermo sun. She made her entrance on E.T.'s arm, as expected, in a suitable dress with a carefully constructed smile. Bastiano stood watch by the rear gate, arms crossed. Sardo, the family lawyer, sat engrossed in his phone. Donna Lucrezia directed the staff with the authority of a field marshal. Rella was not yet there, and she hated the involuntary way her eyes scanned the property for him. The meal began without him. Ettore was boisterous, his laughter echoing as he refilled his wine with singular focus. Donna Lucrezia delivered a stream of criticisms about the food, the renovations, and the oppressive weather. It all felt normal, deceptively safe. Rella appeared as the second course arrived. He emerged from the garden path, dressed in his usual dark clothes, his expression that of a man burdened by immense responsibility. He took the empty chair at the table's far end, gave his mother a brief nod, and then pointedly erased her from his line of sight. The fragile peace on the terrace fractured the moment he arrived. The tension came not from his actions, but from her exhausting performance of innocence against the secret they shared. In that strained quiet, Etre's movement was not a rise, but an eruption. He shot out of his chair, assuming an accuser's stance with his glass held high. His eyes were not drunk, but alight with a cold, clear rage. His question, "Can someone please explain what the hell is happening?" was a spear thrown directly at her and Rella. The razor-sharp query sliced through the conversation, leaving a profound, chilling silence. Donna Lucrezia was a frozen portrait, her fork suspended mid-air. Sardo's phone was lowered. Bastiano's arms uncrossed. Every head turned in a morbid, synchronized ballet from Eater to her, and finally to Rella, witnessing a catastrophe in slow motion. "Eater!" Donna Lucrezia started, her matriarchal tone trying to extinguish the blaze. "No, mother." He cut her off, his gaze a steel cable fixed on the girl. She knows precisely what this is about, and so does he. She gripped her wine glass with both hands, not to drink, but to anchor herself. Her heart pounded, but her hands were unnaturally calm. For 3 days she'd imagined this moment, but no amount of mental rehearsal could brace her for the judgment in every Monte Calvo's gaze, a tribunal that felt like a firing squad. "You," he spat, pointing the glass at her like an accusation, the wine swirling inside. "You were with my brother." The words exploded into the quiet. A fork fell from Donna Luzizia's grip, clattering against her plate. A single brow on Sardo's impassive face lifted, the first crack in his solid composure. The household staff, masters of disappearing, simply melted away. Her eyes locked with Ito's, the same eyes that had once held a future she had foolishly built for a man who deserved none of it. Then, with a steadiness that stunned them all, she fought back. "The second I opened that door, you destroyed everything. Don't you dare blame me for creating my own escape." A 2-second vacuum ensued. In that quiet, his anger collapsed into shock before souring into raw humiliation. Her words were not a plea, but a counterattack, exposing his affair to the entire table. "You're a—" He started to snarl, but Raul was already on his feet. There was no drama, just the sharp grate of his chair on the stone, a sound that clinically severed Ito's sentence. Raul's mere presence made yelling seem pathetic. His posture, the hard line of his back, and his cold, steady stare made the silence itself a weapon. "Sit down," Raul told his brother, the words thick with unstated menace. Ito stayed standing, but the insult on his lips dissolved. He was frozen, his glass shaking, his face flushed, aiming a look of pure sibling hatred at Raul. Just then, Donna Lutetia stood, placing her napkin down with icy purpose. "Raulello, the study, immediately." It was not a request, it was the matriarch enforcing her final authority. Raul's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and an entire unspoken dialogue passed between us. The worry, the contained fury, and a silent request for me to remain strong. He went inside, obeying his mother. Ito stood simmering on the terrace, his hand squeezing his wine glass. Bastiano then moved to occupy the space between them, a human barrier with an obvious purpose. She got up and slipped through a side entrance into the hall. She needed air, a way out of the crossfire of accusations and whispers. Pressing her back to a cool wall, she closed her eyes and took a single shuddering breath. Then the sound of quick steps and a hushed conversation drifted down the hall. Near the staircase, Sardo and Bastiano spoke in low tones. She stood perfectly still, eyes shut, processing the sounds. "The last shipment's figures are off," Sardo said, his voice as casual as if discussing business. "It's the same thing we've seen for months. He's skimming from at least 3 crews I know of, maybe more." Bastiano paused for 2 seconds. "Softer. Does Raul know?" "Raul knows everything," Sardo replied. "He's just waiting for the right moment." Their footsteps faded. She remained against the wall, this new piece of information fitting into a larger, more menacing puzzle she was just starting to see. So there I stood, pressed against a wall in Villa Monte Calvo as the sun blazed through the arches, and her voice carried to me. It was Donna Lutetia, the matriarch, her words cutting through the study door. "You will get rid of that woman, or I am calling a family vote," she said, her tone like ice. "And we both know how that will end." Raul said nothing in reply or was too quiet to overhear. Then, sound. A door opened, then closed. Complete quiet. I was about to slip away when Donna Lucitia appeared and our eyes locked. I was caught. She saw me before I could invent an excuse for being there. Her face said it all. She knew I was eavesdropping, and more importantly, she didn't care. Maybe she intended for me to hear. She stopped a few feet away, and this close, the truths concealed at the table were clear. The delicate web of lines around her eyes, the fragile skin of her throat against her heavy gold necklace, the profound exhaustion from defending a dynasty that never truly gave her power. "Do you think you are the first one?" she asked, her voice laced with history, not hostility. "I was her. Salvatore brought me here at 23, and his mother looked at me with the very same killing glare I am giving you. In time she died, and I took her place. That is how this house functions. The women who last inherit the walls, but they are never given the authority." I met her gaze evenly and said, "Then it sounds like the rules of this house need to be changed." For 3 long seconds, Donna Lucitia just looked at me, and in that silence, I saw something shift in her expression. It was not agreement, but it was recognition, as if she saw I was not just another placeholder. I was a new player who could upend the entire game. She offered no verbal reply, just touched her necklace and walked on without looking back. But her walk was not as steady as before. I was sure our conversation had shaken her. For the next 2 days, Raul was a ghost. He was present in the villa, in meetings with his men, and at the port. But for me, he was a void. No eye contact, no messages, not one sound. Our night in his study felt like a distant, feverish dream. I was once more a minor actress in the Monte Calvo production. Eto had left the next morning and had not returned. He had gone to his city apartment, from which he sent a barrage of enraged texts I didn't open and calls I let ring. He was no longer my problem. Raul was. At least that was my logic as I tried to diagnose the emptiness that grew with each passing silent hour. On the evening of the second day, I called Fametta. She picked up on the first ring, as though expecting me. I started to tell her about the terrace, about Donna Lucitia's threat, but Fametta cut me off. Her tone held no humor, no advice, only sheer terror. "Stop!" she begged. "Aurort, please stop. You are frightening me." I went quiet. "I am serious," she said, and I could hear her stand up and start to pace. "You're entangled with a crime syndicate, and I'm in Naples studying for a fine arts exam like nothing is wrong. What can I possibly do? How could I help? It's impossible." The last word shattered in her throat, a wound far deeper than any barb from Ito or his mother. Fametta, the one I'd always tried to shield, was now desperate to be my protector, leaving us both impossibly lost. "You help by staying exactly where you are," I replied, manufacturing conviction, "and by trusting me." A 5-second silence hung on the line, then softer, "I do, but if they touch you, I'm going to Palermo to burn that villa to the ground. I swear it." A smile nearly broke through, but it hurt, because for the first time, this wasn't about surviving. It was about him. The thought landed like a physical blow, because this was past strategy or revenge. This was primal, a hunger that a single night could never satisfy, an ache that defied all logic. I wanted Raul Montalvo. I wanted the brute, his silent torment, and every single broken piece of him, and his choosing them over me was a betrayal that cut deeper than all of Ito's lies combined. The following morning, Bastiano's text arrived, brutally direct. "Meeting, Great Hall, tonight." Then the line that changed everything. "He requests your attendance." I reread it 3 times. Requests. It didn't command or summon, he asked. Raul Montecalvo was asking. And that single word was more potent than any kiss. I couldn't guess his motives. Was I being claimed or cast aside? Would he fight for us or offer me up as a tribute to his family? Only one thing was clear. He demanded I be there to see it through, whatever the end. And I had no plans to be anywhere else. Chapter 6. What Remains. The great hall of Villa Montecalvo felt built for just such a judgment. Towering ceilings, cold stone walls, and a long table lined with chairs like thrones. This was the room where the old Don built an empire and where Raul seized his power. That night the light was low, the shutters were barred, and the air was thick enough to choke on. When I entered, the tableau was already set. Donna Lutizia sat at the head of the table, her hands knotted together, radiating the tension of a person who feels a hurricane forming but cannot see from which way it will strike. Sorrow flanked her, wearing his usual mask of boredom, a leather portfolio closed before him. Bastiano held his post against the wall, arms folded, eyes sharp, ever silent. To the left were 3 capos I recognized by name only, and at the far end sat Itere, a smug look on his face, coiled and ready for a fight. I lingered at the threshold, an entity in limbo, neither part of the assembly nor sent away. My very presence was owed to Raul's summons. He was the last to arrive, closing the door with the slow, deliberate finality of a man who alone decides when things begin. He wore a dark shirt, no jacket, and his eyes scanned the room before they found mine. In that brief lock of gazes, my own resolve returned. I saw no fear in his, only the hard, unbending glint of polished steel. He spoke not to me, but to them all. This council is not about territory, the port, or our ledgers, he stated. His voice a low frequency that demanded absolute focus. This is about the integrity of our family and the one person who has been methodically poisoning it from within. Ettores' arms uncrossed and his chin rose, his face alight with the certainty that he was about to watch me be excommunicated. He thought Raul was cutting me loose, that his mother had won, that blood would prove thicker than water. He had never been more wrong. For the past 1.5 years, Raul went on, his voice dangerously even, Itre Montecarlo has taken on debt in this family's name, unauthorized. He has used our port for side deals that bypassed this table. He skimmed profits from 3 different ventures before Sorrow ever saw the books, and he has disgraced our name with his private conduct. A complete vacuum of sound filled the room. The captains, moments before inert as stone, were now sitting ramrod straight. Donna Luzizia's jaw dropped, then snapped shut with a click. Sorrow slid open his file and passed out documents, and from the look on the captains' faces, they confirmed Raul's every word, and then some. The blood drained from Itere's face. That's a lie, he managed, his voice hollow and reedy. This is a vendetta. You're doing this because of her. Raul was a mask of indifference. The proof is before you. The numbers are there. The dates are there, as are your signatures. If you want to argue, argue with the paper, not with me. Sorrow gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture with all the finality of a guillotine. The captains scanned the pages, their expressions hardening from impassivity into open contempt. At last, Donna Lucizia got to her feet. Raul, she started, her tone brittle, foreign. He is your brother. Raul's eyes met his mother's without wavering. His face was not cruel, but held no mercy. It was the look of a man who had already passed sentence. You are protecting the son you love, he replied. I am protecting the family I lead. Those are not the same duty. The statement hit Donna Lucizia like a physical strike. Her mouth formed a word that never came. She collapsed back into her chair, utterly defeated, into silence. And that quiet from a woman who was never quiet was the most damning testimony of all. Ettere's head snapped from side to side, a desperate hunt for one friendly face, one possible ally in the wall of allegiance Raoul had built. He found nothing. The captains looked away. Sorrow was already closing his portfolio, the business finished. Bastiano, no longer a statue, shifted his weight, becoming a physical barrier between Ettore and the door. He knew what was coming next. Flight. "You are banished," Raoul announced, each word a hammer blow of judgment. "From Palermo, from this family, and from all Monte Carlo business. As of this moment, you are no one to me." Ettore surged from his chair with a screech of wood on stone. His fists white, his glare pure, distilled hatred for Raoul. And then his eyes drifted to me. I stood in the corner, my back pressed to the cold wall, trying to fade into the shadows. But as Ettore's furious eyes found mine, I held my ground. I gave him the same cool, unaffected stare I had on the terrace 3 days ago, when he'd tried to use me as a pawn. "This isn't over," he hissed, his gaze locked on me. His voice was low, strained with control, but it sent a tremor through the floorboards and into my bones. It was more than anger, it was a vow made in blood. The kind a man like Ettore embraces when he has nothing left but a reason to keep breathing. He turned and left without a second glance. Bastiano moved, and the heavy door clicked shut, the noise sharp against the stone. The room began to empty. The captains filed out first, silent, their shoulders heavy with the evening's events. Sorrow gathered his papers, gave Raoul a curt nod, and departed with the easy pace of a man who knows time is on his side. Donna Lucizia was the last. She rose slowly, shot her son one inscrutable look, and was gone. Bastiano followed, shutting the door again. And then there were two. Raoul remained at the table's head, his hands braced on the surface, his posture slumping just enough to show the true price of his victory. I peeled myself away from the wall and started toward him, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. "Was all of this for me?" I asked, stopping on the opposite side of the table. He raised his head. His eyes were weary, but their usual fire was still there, now shot through with something new, a raw, fragile human quality. "I did this because it had to be done," he said, "but it would not have been done tonight if not for you." The absolute truth of that admission slipped past my guard in a way no physical touch ever had. This was the essence of Rello Montecarvo, a man who tells the truth when it costs the most, who never dilutes reality to make it easier to swallow. I circled the end of the table. I stood before him, so close I could feel the heat coming off his body, could smell the scent of old books and dark coffee that was uniquely his. I lifted my hand to his face, my fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw, the warmth of his skin, the slight rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow. He shut his eyes. In that simple act, Rello Montecarvo closing his eyes to my touch, as if finally accepting solace without condition. I knew it was the most vulnerable he had ever been with another soul, more naked than the night in his library, more honest than any words he could ever speak. His eyes stayed shut, a quiet act of surrender there in the history-soaked room. We found our way to the garden later, to the very stone bench where everything between us first grew tangled. The evening was perfect, with the lights of Palermo strewn across the hills like fallen stars. The air smelled of salt and orange blossoms, and a ship's low horn called from the harbor. Raoul sat beside me, quiet, but it was not the tense, brittle silence of the last 2 days. It was the calm that settles between two people who have finally stopped fighting a current and have simply let it take them. I rested my head against his shoulder, but he did not move. There was no embrace, no word, no gesture to pull me closer. He was simply there, an unyielding presence, as permanent as the villa's ancient stone and the deep-rooted orange groves. Closing my eyes, I drew a breath, absorbing the solid feel of him and the warmth of the Sicilian air. We were still. We had found a quiet armistice. The fighting was done. Ettore was vanquished. The family understood the truth. And in a world I entered seeking only retribution, I had found something real. But as the wind changed, carrying a chill off the water, Ettore's parting threat returned not as a memory, but as a cold weight of certainty. He had spoken only 4 words, his eyes holding mine as he left, with the quiet menace of a man who has no need for volume to inspire terror. This is not finished. For the first time since the ordeal started, I felt the chilling conviction that he was right. Here, Volume 1 concludes, but the second is already written. It is available for you now for a modest sum. Just 3 months of quiet, that was my only wish. Raoul with me, Ettore gone. The villa was tranquil until a late-night telephone call destroyed the peace. On the line was my sister, the one person in this world I truly treasure, sobbing with the desperation I had never heard. And before I could speak, a man's voice cut in. It was cold, detached, and dreadfully familiar. You know my demands, Hortensia, and you are aware of the price for refusal. He did not return with rage. He came back with a chillingly precise strategy. Russian associates, and my sister as his leverage. The cost of her life was the one oath I swore I would die before breaking to go back to him and betray Raoul. As you've gathered, this is merely a preview of Volume 2. To witness the entire, unfiltered saga, you need only select the first link in the pinned comment. I will await you there. As a simple reminder, selecting that initial link in the comments grants you the entirety of Book 2, free of ads. It is that straightforward. I am finding great satisfaction in creating Book 2. And given your reception, I can assure you the story only descends into deeper shadows from here. This is our entry into narratives with far graver stakes. True, dark romance. Because this next part is so much more visceral, it would be censored on this platform. This private area is where I can be completely unrestrained and produce my finest work for you. Remember, the channel lost its monetization. This is how I support my team and continue to deliver those high-quality narratives to you. I have more updates coming soon. I will be looking for you at the first link in the pinned comment. Regrettably, some people have been pirating our audio, stealing the full story only to re-upload it here.
From a forensic psychological perspective, Hortensia's trajectory is highly coherent. Following acute relational betrayal, she does not collapse outwardly. Instead, she shifts into a controlled retaliatory mode. This response suggests not emotional emptiness, but adaptive compartmentalization. Individuals who have survived earlier instability often become exceptionally functional in crisis. They do not panic first. They organize first. That is not coldness. It is survival architecture. Ettore demonstrates traits consistent with entitlement-based narcissistic relating. He compartmentalizes deception, assumes continued access to affection, and appears more offended by exposure than by wrongdoing. Such personalities often destabilize their partner's internal reality. The victim begins by asking, "Oh, how could he do this?" but eventually asks the more dangerous question, "What does this make me?" That identity fracture is where revenge fantasies become psychologically attractive. Revenge promises structure. It gives pain a task. Rel, however, complicates the revenge template. He is not psychologically safe, but he is emotionally legible. That distinction matters. Traumatized individuals are sometimes drawn not to goodness, but to coherence. A dangerous person who is internally consistent can feel more trustworthy than a charming person who is emotionally fraudulent. This is why Hortensia's attachment shifts. It is not simply lust or rebellion, it is a nervous system responding to perceived solidity. Still, the central lesson is cautionary. Trauma can make intensity feel like truth. Shared pain can resemble intimacy. Recognition can resemble rescue. None of those equivalences are guaranteed. What saves Hortensia from complete self-betrayal is not romance. It is self-observation. She notices when anger becomes indifference. She notices when revenge stops feeling like justice. She notices when desire begins to replace strategy. In clinical terms, that is the return of reflective capacity. And reflective capacity is everything. It is the difference between reenacting trauma and integrating it. The lesson then is precise. Suffering does not automatically make a person wise, but the willingness to examine suffering honestly can restore agency. Hortensia becomes psychologically stronger not when she feels less, but when she becomes capable of naming what she feels without lying to herself. That is where real recovery begins.